To me,
But
I think the one album where the Beatles, if you're talking about comparing early Stones to early Beatles,
yes,
uh, I'll compare the English pressing of A Hard Day's Night over any early Stones album. Now, that
okay,
doesn't mean there aren't some great albums with some fantastic cuts on them. I'm just saying that one album, that's to me,
a
that
hard, a
was
hard,
their
a
A
hard
Hard
day's
Day's
night.
Night.
Okay,
Yeah, 13 songs on it. 10 were written by John Lennon, three were written by Paul McCartney. The
okay,
three written by Paul McCartney are as good as the three of John's best on that album. John dominates,
okay.
and they wrote it up within days practically because they were bit. I mean, the whole album, when you listen to it, for that early sound, that
Yeah,
is their best album. I've called it their very first classic album. The first two have
absolutely.
weaknesses, but not this one.
No,
This
The
no.
one
This
UK
stands the
version too. We
test
have
of
to
time.
clarify. It's
this
the
has
UK
got this has got obviously a hard day's night. Tell me why you cried. Okay, uh, I should have known better with a girl like you. I'm happy just to dance with you. I mean, these are all like classic home
Sang by
runs right here.
George, but written for George by John.
Absolutely love the song, and I love her. That little
Right.
intro, dun 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 dun.
Which George made up. Paul
yeah.
did not write that part for that song. George made up that going down, down, down
Yeah,
riff. And he
yeah.
says, Paul later said, I didn't write that. George came up with it. And yet that's the thing you remember out of that whole song.
Oh, yeah.
You
That's the hook right there.
That's the hook.
And that
George
was
wrote
what
the
George
hook.
was famous for.
Yeah.
Okay. So should have known better with a girl like you. If I fell in love with you and I love her. These are great. I mean, these songs stand the test of time, big time.
Absolutely.
Can't Buy Me Love. Ringo's theme. This boy. A Hard Day's Night again. I think there was an instrumental version and a singing version on A Hard Day's Night. This is a
Well,
great
that's the American version that you
Yeah.
got there.
Well,
Yeah.
that's where it starts to get confusing because let
Yeah.
me just show you this, okay? I've got UK versions and US versions on on the very first Stones album and on the second Stones album. The first one was 64, the second one was 65. And let me just, for a comparison, since this is 64, let me just read the track list. Now, I thought every one of these songs was like, an iconic song that I recognize and probably could sing a couple of bars from, after all these years. But okay, so here we have the Stones' debut album in 1964. But again, it wasn't written by the Rolling Stones. I haven't found one here yet that was. I stand corrected. Uh, uh, Tell Me by Mick Jagger and Keith Richards.
So this must have come out after their first single that was written by the Beatles, because as the story goes, John Lennon and Paul went into a corner and wrote "I Want to Be Your Man" right in front of them. John later said we actually had the bit, but we added a bit right there in front of them, so they thought we wrote it there and then. So they actually had already kind of worked on it, and they knew that it wasn't quite. That's why they were going to hand it to Ringo, because it was a work song, and so they were going to give it to Ringo, and so they gave it to the Stones, and that's when the Stones were amazed, and a couple of them actually thought they'd try it. And the amazing thing is, Royce, for Jagger and Richards to actually turn out to be as good as songwriters as they were based on that experience, that's pretty amazing.
Okay, the next one is Something New, Something New. That came out in January of 64. And it starts out, I'll Cry Instead, Things We Said Today, Anytime at All, When I Get Home, Slow Down, Matchbox, Tell Me Why You Cried, and I Love Her. I love that song. I'm Happy Just to Dance with You, and okay, that's it. The Calm Gimmer. I can't even read it.
Komm, gib mir deine Hand.
That's exactly what it is. Thank you. But anyway,
I want to hold your hand in German.
Yeah.
I probably raped that, but it's
is there anybody that would take that album over the Stones playlist I read?
that's actually what I consider one of the weaker albums by the Beatles. I love the album for one reason.
Yeah.
I like the fact that the Beatles start sounding like what we came to know the Beatles to sound like. They've got the 3-part harmony. I mean, it's all over the first album, but it's Beatlistic on this album.
Right.
And I think that was the biggest step forward for the second album. But I think it was also weaker than their first and nowhere near as good as what was going to come right next, which was, of course, Hard Day's Night, you know.
Right.
But I think that album, I mean, first of all, you're talking about the freaking Beatles. So with the possible exception of that horror that they put out called Yellow Submarine. And even that had Hey Bulldog.
Probably the song I sang most when I was in my youth was Yellow Submarine.
Yeah. But, anyway. I mean, as an album, the Beatles had no time for it. It wasn't planned by them. This cartoon was coming out, and they had, George's 2 songs. He had already offered up for Sgt. Pepper, and George Martin, and Paul had to kind of corner him and say, this isn't good enough. We're really writing some good stuff. That's when he came up with Within You, Without You. But with the exception of that album, I think the second album, and it's got some gems on it. They're the Beatles, but I think they were still searching, and they found their sound on here, and I'm talking vocally only. Some of the songs, I don't know, Every Little Thing, the timpani kind of thing was a little rich for me, a little bit too precious. Little Child could have been written in a drunken stupor, I think, a little bit. But still, it's the Beatles singing Little Child. Yeah. Little child, won't you? I mean, it's the Beatles. The only reason I became aware of the Stones was I was a Beatle fan. And, of course, the Stones, their hits, I loved. Their hits, right?
Oh, yeah.
The first Stones album I ever bought wasn't until Sticky Fingers, and then I went back and got Let It Bleed, because I realized Let It Bleed for me. Now I know there are a lot of Exile, whatever, but for me, it's Let It Bleed onward. Even though that's 69, the Stones are no longer just copying. Well, except for the title, Let It Be, Let It Bleed, but they're sonically no longer just copying the Beatles. They've got their own sound now.
Yeah.
And that's when I love the Stones, even though when I go back to the 60s, my favorite lineup is with Brian Jones, who was a genius, quirky genius in his own. He just had a, termination date stamped on his forehead. He was destined to be a pop star, to reach psychedelia, and then pass away. He was a flaming star. And, he'd be playing some weird instrument on stage, plucking, with a big long feather or a sitar. And he had like the explorative drive that Lennon and McCartney naturally had. And he gravitated to the Beatles quite a bit. He was even on a couple of their recordings.